All right, welcome to Module 8. This is where we're going to dive into different annotations to really take our video to the next level. We're going to add callouts and arrows and blurs and shapes and all kinds of things. We're going to first start out with callouts and talk about what callouts are, which are essentially text and boxes with text inside of it. So we'll talk about that. They could be like thought bubbles. They could be just squares with some text in it or just text. We'll also talk about arrows being able to point at different portions of your screen, and we can animate these arrows, which we'll learn about in the next section, and show you how to adjust the visuals of the arrows. Then we'll get into shapes. Now, shapes really come in handy when we start to get into animation, because shapes allow us to create different types of effects and different types of masks as well. So let's learn about, in this section, we'll learn about using shapes and how to add that to our video. Then we'll talk about blurs and highlights. So blurs allow us to really blur out portions of our screen, but highlights allow us to draw the viewer's attention to portions of our screen. So we'll talk about both of those and how to adjust the properties in both of them. And then finally, we'll dive into one of my favorite annotations, which you've seen already throughout this course, and that is the sketch motion annotations and how to draw around certain areas or how to even draw an arrow to point at certain things. It's like one of my favorite annotations. And again, you've already been seeing it throughout the videos here. But let's dive into that and everything about annotations in this section. We have been working with some annotations up to now, but now let's dive in and get to know everything we can do with annotations. You can resume using one of our previous projects or start a new project. I will create a new project that eventually will become an animated intro for my screen recording. I like to do animated intros in different projects, save them to my library, and then add them to other projects I want. Let's dive right into annotations. Click on Annotations on the left to get to all of our annotations. There are several different types of annotations. We have callouts, arrows and lines, blur and highlight, sketch motions, and keyboard callouts. The first three tabs allow us to change the style and theme. Let's go to the first one called callouts. You'll notice two options on the top of the callouts. The first one allows us to select the style of callouts we want, and the second option will enable us to choose the theme. As we have learned, if you create a theme, this is a great way to select that theme and have your callouts align with that style. The style section shows you various types of callouts, while the theme changes the colors of the styles. Selecting no theme will give you a multicolor option. You can see the style of the callouts changed based on what I select in the style. Once you find a callout you want, drag the annotation on the canvas or down to the timeline. The default length of the callout is 5 seconds, but we can adjust the length on the timeline like we can with any other object on our timeline by dragging the end of our annotation to make it longer or shorter in duration. If you only want text, find the callout option without a shape around it and drag it to your canvas or timeline. Depending on the annotation you selected, you can see tabs to change the shape, color, outlines, outline style, and text styles in the Properties panel. Pause the video here and explore changing some of these properties. If you find an annotation you like and may use often, please add it to your favorites. To add something to your favorites, hover over the annotation, and on the top right is a star. Once you see the star, click on it. Now, if you go to the Favorites section, you will see all of the annotations and effects you like and plan to use often in one location. It is a quick and easy way to get to your most commonly used annotations and effects. Let's go back to our callout annotations. I will drag out the text annotation, which is one of my most common annotations. There are a couple of the properties I want to draw attention to here. You can make fundamental text changes like font, color, size, style, and alignment. And there is also something called V spacing and H spacing. Let's click and drag these dials. You can see that nothing changes with V space because we have not typed anything in. Let's type out some text and ensure we have a few lines. The text stays within the bounding box. If you want more space for the text, you can resize the bounding box by dragging the handles around the text. Because I up my bounding box drastically, when the text becomes 2 lines, notice a lot of space between the 2 lines. That is what this property affects, the vertical spacing between the lines so you can get the exact style that you want. The H spacing stands for horizontal spacing, which affects the spacing between the letters of the text. You may or may not want this style, but knowing it's there is good. You can adjust the bounding box as wide or as tall as you want. The alignment tools give you a standard left, center, and right, which will change how the text looks. It also allows you to have your text centered in the bounding box, aligned to the top, and finally, the bottom of your bounding box. You can also disable or keep enabled auto resizing text. Notice that the text becomes smaller if I move my text box and make it smaller. If I turn this off though, it starts to cut off the text. If you choose this option, you will always have to ensure that your text box has enough space, but it will at least prevent the text from getting smaller if you want the text to remain the same size. You can rotate the text box by clicking on the circle off to the right of the middle circle. Selecting the circle and rotating it around will turn your text box around without messing up your text, allowing you to get some cool effects with your text. These are various things that you can do when working with text. Next, let's dive into the second tab, which uses arrows and lines. The next annotation I'm going to cover is the arrows and lines. Ensure you're back in the annotation section and click on the second tab from the left, which has an icon of an arrow. The section has various arrows and lines that we can use throughout our video. These arrows and lines allow us to highlight and point to important parts of our video. To use one, click and drag the annotation to your canvas or timeline. You can adjust the style and theme, like the shapes, to get various arrows and line styles. Once an arrow is on the canvas and it is selected, notice the properties that you can adjust on the right-hand side. We can switch the theme even after we have it on our timeline. We can change the color to any color that we want. And then we have a line style. It does not matter if you dragged out an arrow or a line, they have the same options. We can add an arrow on either end of the line just by selecting the first or last drop-down in the line style selection. Depending on the direction you want your arrow to point, you can select an arrow to show up on the left or right of the line. In the middle, we have the type of line we want. We can either do a solid line, a dotted line, or a dashed line. These lines go well with like an animated map or something like that. Changing this will increase the size of the line and allow us to create better visibility when we point or underline things. The last option is the opacity. Opacity will just adjust the visibility of the line. Making a see-through line could allow the line to be transparent and create a highlighter look if you place the annotation over text or something similar. It comes in handy when we animate these arrows and lines to our narration. We'll get into animation, but for now, these annotations come out of the box with Camtasia. Let's move on to the next section, which is shapes. We've already talked about callouts, which essentially are shapes with text, and in some cases just text. In the next tab, we see just shapes. We have the same style and theme as we do with the other tabs, which will give us various options. But shapes are used for all kinds of things. We can use shapes for style in our videos, add animated intros, and masking, create effects like track mats, and more. This section has basic shapes like circles, stars, squares, square outlines, octagons, and triangles. When you drag a shape onto the canvas, notice the properties can change. You can change out the shape, which means even if you start with an ellipse, you can switch to something else later on without messing up the timeline. Most of the next settings will also be the same across all shapes, so I won't go over each one, but let's see what else we can change. We can adjust the fill color and change it from solid to gradients. If you change to a gradient, you can only choose one color, but it will create a gradient for you. I'm going to switch back to solid. Around the shape is an outline. The next section allows you to adjust settings about the outline. You can change color to whatever color you want. The style of an outline gives you various styles of solid, dotted, and dashed lines. You can adjust the thickness just like you can with arrows, lines, and opacity. On these shapes, we can go into the visual properties where we can adjust the shape's scale, rotation, position, width, and skew for various effects. Visual properties allow me to get the exact style I want. You can also adjust these properties on the canvas by clicking and dragging the shape around the canvas. Notice how the properties adjust as I click and drag. You can also use the handlebars on the edge. Grab one of the circles to adjust the width and height of the shape. In the middle, we can grab the circle off to the right of the middle to rotate the object. Let's remove these test shapes and drag out a rectangle. We'll change the color to the Learning Dojo color here. Now I will expand this shape to fill the entire canvas. I can animate this wrangle to start off the canvas and move onto the canvas. Once it is done animating, I can animate text. I could animate this on top of the rectangle and have it appear after it is done animating. I could then create an animation where it leaves the canvas and then move on with my video. That animation could give me a nice title break between sections of my video, and is how you can use shapes and callouts to get some nice visual looks. In fact, the title bar on the top left is two rectangles animating in, followed by a text callout to separate various sections of the video like this one. That helps you see that we are learning the building blocks that will help you create some awesome effects. Let's learn how to blur sections of our screen in the next annotation type. The next annotation tab we can use is the Blur and Highlight tab. Blur allows us to blur out sensitive information, spotlight important contents while blurring or anything else, highlight a portion of the screen, or pixelate a portion. Let's cover each of these options. First, let's start with Blur. To add a blur annotation, click and drag the first option onto the canvas. We will see that the blur annotation has been added to our timeline. It does not fill up the entire screen, but we can adjust the timing by dragging the end of the blur annotation on the timeline. A blur is essentially a square on the canvas. We can adjust the height and width of the square right on the canvas or within our properties. Typically, this is used to blur out sensitive information. You can adjust the intensity of the blur by clicking and dragging the intensity slider. Notice how the intensity of the blur changes based on the slider's value. If you want to blur out everything except the box, click Invert. Invert will blur out everything but what's under the box. You can use this to draw someone's attention to a portion of the screen and minimize their attention on other parts of the screen. The following annotation is a spotlight. Let's get rid of the blur and drag on a spotlight annotation. Out of the box, this is very much like an inverted blur, but the default look darkens everything outside of the box. If you don't want to blur the rest of the screen, but darken it a bit, then this effect is perfect. Notice I can drag out the box anywhere on the canvas and even adjust the size of the box. One thing I did not mention with the blur, but it is the same with both, is the ability to save the adjustments as a new annotation. Select the spotlight and go into the annotation properties. We can adjust the intensity, which will darken or lighten the fade. Once we get the look we want, instead of remembering to use these same intensity settings down the road, clicking the plus icon will add the blur or spotlight to our annotations window. You can see that this option has a little person on it indicating I designed it. But now, if I drag this annotation onto my canvas or timeline, it has my adjustments for intensity rather than what was there by default. We refer to these as user presets. Next, let's explore highlight. I will remove my spotlight to play around with what the highlight can do. Now let's drag on the highlight. Like the blur and the spotlight, you will see a rectangle with an effect. You can do all the normal resizing like you could do with the others, but we can also change the highlight color. Select the drop-down box and choose the type of highlight you want. Think of this like a physical highlighter. You can animate this to draw someone's attention to the highlighted text or a portion of the screen. If you want to adjust the opacity even more, you can change the opacity here. It will always be somewhat see-through, even if the opacity is set to 100%, so keep that in mind.
That is the point of the highlight, to color over a portion of the screen. Similar to what you can do with the blur, we can also invert the highlight and highlight everything else but what's under the square. The last option within this section is to pixelate. Let's drag this option and delete our highlight. Pixelate works almost identical to blur, which is more of a stylistic choice. Pixelating could come in handy to pixelate someone's face or a portion of the video. All I have to do to adjust the style is go up to the annotation properties and adjust the intensity. The larger the number, the larger the pixel size, so the squares are bigger. The smaller the number, the smaller the pixels become, and more pixels come into play. So if you want to keep the person's silhouette, make the number smaller so they can still tell the person's silhouette. But if you want to conceal what is below the square, then keep the intensity number up. It is important to note though that some third-party tools can reverse pixelization, secure confidential information by covering it up with a shape rather than blur or pixelization for safety. Those are all the various options for using blur and highlight annotations within Camtasia. Now let's talk about another way to draw someone's attention to a portion of the screen by using sketch motion and showing keystrokes. We'll do that next. The next tab is sketch motion. We have already seen sketch motion in action during this training. When I have outlined a portion of the screen to draw your attention to what I'm talking about, I usually use a sketch motion. Sketch motions are animated outlines. In our shapes section, we could add on a shape outline. Sketch motions are like that, but they are animated and they look like they're hand-drawn. Let's drag out one to our canvas. You can eliminate other annotations that you may be working with before you drag one out to your canvas. It will add a sketch motion to my timeline, depending on where my playhead is positioned. I can adjust the length of my sketch motion on my timeline just like I can with annotations. Let's go to our annotation settings. The first option is to change the color of our annotation. Select the drop-down and select the color you want. Remember, you probably want one that will contrast nicely with your background to help with accessibility. You can see the animation play by clicking on play, hitting the spacebar, or moving your playhead back and forth to see how the annotation is sketched. Depending on which one you choose, the outline may look like it was hand-drawn or just straight lines. The next property we can change is the thickness of the outline. You can see how much thicker the outline becomes as I adjust the outline. The next option is the draw time. This is currently set to 1 second, but you can adjust the slider or enter a number to change the seconds. Now flip the sketch horizontally or vertically if you want the animation to look a little bit different. The style you choose could depend on what you're highlighting in the video. You can change those properties. The key to the sketch motions is adjusting the annotation size. You can click and drag the annotation like you can with any shape. Sometimes it will give you a little space around the object that you're highlighting. Let's quickly cover keystrokes as well. You would use these annotations when telling the viewer what buttons to click when you are doing a software tutorial. There are 4 styles, but they all work the same. I'm going to drag one onto the screen. You can change the keystroke style by clicking on the Style dropdown. That swaps between the styles we see in the annotation section. Now we can resize the keystroke image, but notice that when I do that, it stays proportional. Visually, that's all we do. Now let's change the text on the screen. That is where the keys section comes into play. Click inside of this and hit any key or combination of keys that you want displayed on the screen. For example, if I'm trying to teach someone that they can press Ctrl and Z to undo, I click in the box and then I press Ctrl and Z keys. You can see that the buttons update automatically and add a plus between the keys that are pressed. That wraps up annotations. We'll be using annotations a lot, especially when animating our content. Let's wrap up what we've learned about in this section before we move on.
So this section was all about annotations. Annotations are going to come in handy when we get into the next section, which is going to be animations, because we're going to be able to take our annotations and animate them to really create some cool effects. We talked about callouts, which are text or text boxes or thought bubbles. So we talked about what you can do with those and how you can adjust the properties. We also talked about arrows, being able to point and draw the viewer's attention to certain areas of your screen. We then talked about shapes and the different things that you can do with shapes, and that's going to come in handy, especially with the animations and being able to create some cool lower thirds or masks or other things like that. We then talked about being able to blur portions of your screen and highlight portions of your screen and how we can change the blur effect and the highlight effect as well. And then finally, we went into my favorite annotation, which is the sketch motion, being able to create a draw effect, which you have already been seeing throughout this course and will continue to see me using this annotation type. So really that is the being able to add content on top of our screen recordings, or even being able to add content onto a blank portion of our screen and have different annotations animate in or animate out. So really the annotations come in handy when we start to talk about animations, or we start to talk about being able to draw the learner's attention to certain portions of our screen. So it was an important section, but now we're ready to move on to animations, which is one of my favorite sections. So let's go ahead and do that.